The Hollywood illusion. It's deeply embedded in our minds. You watch a movie about the Middle Ages, and there he is, the noble knight who takes a terrible sword blow. He falls, whispers his last words of honor, and dies quickly. The end. The viewer walks away, romanticizing a valiant death on the battlefield. That is a lie. The real medieval battle wasn't about a noble death, but about a slow, agonizing suffering that stretched into weeks. A sword or an arrow was rarely the last thing you saw. The main and most effective killer wasn't a person, but an invisible, unnamed enemy, infection and sepsis. If you were there, you would feel this horror in every cell. You're wounded. A pike thrust. First, the shock and the bleeding you have to stop, but that's only the beginning. A battle survivor faced a nightmare they didn't show in the movies. The wound begins to swell, turn red, and ooze pus. You stand there, surrounded by the smell of hot iron used to cauterize an artery. But even that smell couldn't drown out the sickening, sweet aroma of decaying flesh that is the scent of sepsis. Infection claimed more lives than the weapons themselves. Surviving knights, those who endured the fiercest fighting, died weeks later in agony from blood poisoning. Doctors knew infection was deadly, but had absolutely no understanding of its cause. No germ theory. Instead, they believed in the imbalance of the four humors: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile. The most absurd and deadly diagnosis, pus and swelling, were often interpreted as a good sign. Physicians believed this was the body expelling bad humors or miasmas, poisonous air. This conviction, that pus was matter necessary for healing, doomed the patient. Understand this, your death would likely come not from a penetrating wound, but from a fatal diagnostic error based on a 1,000-year-old mistake. Survival depended not on the strength of your armor, but on luck, willpower, and whether or not the wrong humor got into your wound. While some died from this pseudo-logic, others, through sheer luck or instinct, tried to combat the bleeding. But if death was slow, how did they try to stop the immediate process when every second counted? The first and main priority on the battlefield, or even during a farm accident, was to stop the fountain of blood. It was a raw, visceral fight for life. In antiquity and the Middle Ages, they knew well that massive hemorrhage would kill faster than any infection. When you're wounded, there's no sterile bandage nearby. There's only what's at hand, and it was barbaric. Warriors and barber surgeons, who shaved and operated, resorted to primitive tourniquets. These could be leather straps, belts, or ropes, tightened above the wound. This technique, known since the 4th century BC, could save you from instant death, but you immediately started a dangerous game of frozen limb. Leave the tourniquet on too long? Gas gangrene and amputation were inevitable. If there was no tourniquet, anything that could stop the blood by acting as a primitive coagulant was used. This could be ash, clay, or even animal dung, which was thought to be warming and drawing out the illness. Peasants used moss, dirt, or cobwebs for bandaging. A physician from the 1st century BC advised Roman soldiers to wrap wounds with cobwebs and honey. While the cobwebs did nothing, honey and wine. Amidst all this dangerous nonsense based on superstition and desperation, suddenly appeared remedies that we, people of the 21st century, can only praise. This substance was applied directly to wounds. Why? Because it created a barrier against dirt and slowed bacterial growth. We know it works. Honey is a natural antiseptic, and it's still used in modern wound dressings. Medieval healers found this through trial and error, without having any idea why it worked. Wounds were often washed with wine or vinegar. Pure luck again. The acidity of vinegar and the alcohol in wine really did inhibit the growth of some bacteria. Understand the irony. The most effective aid came not from expensive university doctors with their humors, but from a random pot of honey or a barrel of sour wine. But even these miracle cures couldn't help when the damage was too great. When improvised first aid failed, surgery awaited the patient, and there, an even more unbearable truth about medieval pain relief lay in wait. Forget the romanticized notions of gentle sedatives and healing herbs. In the Middle Ages, pain relief was an act of violence in itself and sometimes a separate way to die. Surgeons weren't looking for painlessness, but for silence. A quiet patient was compliant, and here are the three most common and utterly brutal methods they used. Before learning how to deliver a knockout, doctors noticed that soldiers who lay in the snow for hours screamed less when a limb was cut off. Imagine, you're not just lying in the snow, you are deliberately packed into it to bring the limb to a state of frozen monolithic quality. One ingenious doctor in northern France made patients stand waist deep in an icy river before surgery. The limb doesn't hurt because it's practically dead, but it was a deadly game. Too little time, you feel everything. Too much, you get frostbite on top of your injury. In the 14th century, a monk surgeon tried to numb an arm by burying it in the snow for an entire night. The patient felt no pain during the operation. The bad news? The arm had to be amputated because it was completely frozen, and that was the reason for its removal. If cold didn't work, the bite and pray method was used. The patient was given something to chew on, a leather strap, if they were rich, a rope, or simply a wooden stick. About 60% of patients who underwent this method broke their teeth from the unbearable pain. This was a favorite anesthetic. The more serious the operation, the more you had to drink, up to an entire barrel before a leg amputation. London hospitals spent more on wine for patients than on medical supplies. Alcohol not only failed to dull the pain, as doctors believed, but also thinned the blood. Thus, the drunken patient turned into a human fountain, increasing the risk of death from the blood loss they were trying to save him from. The most brutal and probably the fastest method was a straight physical knockout. A strong right hook was officially included in medical manuscripts as a necessary surgical skill. Hospitals hired special subdual assistants, strong guys whose only job was to knock the patient out. This was probably the only period in medical history when the question, "How hard can you hit?" was a legitimate interview question. A journal entry recorded, "Patient proved difficult to subdue, problem solved by the quick application of a fist to the temple." These men were literal knockout artists. And of course, this method had its problems. Sometimes the patient woke up mid-operation. In one recorded case, the patient woke up, got scared, headbutted the surgeon, and they both passed out. Finally, they were ready for surgery. What was the main quality of a surgeon in an era where speed equaled chance? Forget precision, hygiene, or even the integrity of the instruments. In the Middle Ages, the surgeon's main quality was one: speed. You weren't a doctor, but a Formula One race car driver in the operating room, where the lap time was measured in the life of your patient. Why was speed everything? Because in the absence of sterility, reliable anesthesia, and an understanding of hemostasis, your only chance was to finish the cutting before the patient died from pain shock or total blood loss. If you found yourself in a medieval operating theater, yes, they were literally theaters where onlookers came and even placed bets, you would feel the atmosphere not of a medical facility, but of a sporting event. You would hear the ticking of a metronome or the flipping sand in a giant hourglass. You didn't need just any surgeon, you needed a star. And such a star was Robert Liston, a Scottish surgeon, the champion of speed operations. Robert Liston could amputate a leg in 28 seconds. That's less time than it takes to heat a hot dog in the microwave. For such speed, even a saw was often not good enough. Surgeons switched to the chisel and mallet method. You hear the blacksmith's hammer, literally borrowed from the local blacksmith, tapping on your bone as if you were part of a home renovation. The cult of speed created a catastrophe that went down in history. The most famous case belongs to that very champion, Robert Liston. During a high-speed amputation, Liston moved so fast that he accidentally cut off 3 fingers of his assistant. With a swing of his arm, he also slashed the coat of an observer, a spectator. The assistant and the spectator both died of infection later. The patient also died. This is probably the only operation in history with a 300% mortality rate. He wasn't a doctor. He was a showman athlete who, like a football player, performed a victory dance, hoisting the amputated limb high to the applause of the crowd. The consequences of this race were monstrous. In the rush, a surgeon could amputate the wrong leg, realize the mistake, and cut off the second one. Every fourth patient died not from the operation itself, but because the surgeon closed up the wound, forgetting pieces of tissue or even whole instruments like a piece of the saw inside. These operations were so unbearable that the hospital walls themselves couldn't drown out the horror. What did the doctors do about the screams? Screams. This was the main byproduct of medieval surgery. And here we come to the point of absolute absurdity. Instead of finally asking how to make surgery less painful, medieval medicine found a brilliant solution. Learn to drown out the screams. Medieval hospitals recognized their patients as the loudest neighbors from hell. The answer wasn't anesthesia, but soundproofing. Hospitals created special screaming rooms for operations. These were soundproof chambers, their walls packed with wool, hay, and anything that could muffle the sound. One hospital hired a professional wall stuffer who usually worked in castles. His title was Master of Subdual. When isolation failed, complete sound replacement came into play. It was a real medieval circus. If a scream couldn't be stopped, it had to be drowned out. Wealthy patients got a full orchestra. For the poor, they made do with a guy who was bad at beating a drum. Some hospitals even had more musicians on staff than doctors. Their logic was deadly. Music is cheaper than medicine, and patients complain less when they can't hear themselves. When the chanting monks couldn't outscream the patients, they were replaced by town drunks, whose loud singing did the job much better. At this point, medieval surgery finally ceased to be medicine and became show business. Surgeons used jugglers, told obscene jokes to distract the patients and make them blush, forgetting the pain, and even made animal noises, like mooing like cows to confuse the patient. The priority was not your survival or comfort, but managing the outside perception of the horror. Hospitals tried to sell the public and themselves the illusion that everything was fine, drowning out the sounds with drums. Movies showed us valiant knights falling with a sword in hand and wise monks with herbs, but now you know the truth. Medieval medicine was a brutal yet fascinating fight for survival. This was an era where your doctor might hit you, force you to drink yourself into unconsciousness, or amputate your leg in 28 seconds in front of a crowd of spectators. It was a world where the main achievement was not healing, but the ability to suppress a scream, where a hospital spent more on musicians than on bandages. The truth is, survival was a pure lottery, and every person who recovered was a miracle. We live in an age of antibiotics, anesthesia, and sterility, but to truly appreciate this gift, we must remember that visceral and brutal world, where the only thing standing between life and agony was a quick punch or a cup of blood-thinning wine. If you'd like, I can now translate this text with the very short paragraphs back into Russian, or I can focus on summarizing the key points of the text.